What's going on, everyone? Ali Reza here, back with a brand new episode of Iran Tech, and today we're going to be talking about bone marrow transplant procedures, which is typically used in cases of leukemia, aplastic anemia, lymphomas, and certain types of immune system disorders. Now, let's take the example of leukemia, which is a type of cancer of the blood. Now, when we're talking about cancer, we have cells in the body creating cancer cells, unhealthy cells, and you can't really do anything about those ruined cells that are creating unhealthy cells. You can't do anything when it comes to like drugs, because this is where we have like chemotherapy and certain really intensive procedures. Now, in the case of bone marrow transplant, in the bone marrow we have the cells that are creating the cells in the body, particularly related to the blood. So we can't do anything about the damaged cells in the bone marrow, so we need to replace them with healthy bone marrow cells that can repopulate the bone marrow with healthy cells so that we no longer create unhealthy cells within the body. But that's a lot more of a complicated procedure than it may sound. So in this episode, we're going to be taking a closer look at bone marrow transplant procedure and another type of modern type of therapy related to cell therapy. So I mentioned a few cases in which a bone marrow transplant procedure may be used. So without any further ado, let's take a closer look at what the procedure actually looks like.
A bone marrow transplant is a critical procedure used to treat diseases that affect the bone marrow's ability to produce healthy blood cells, such as leukemia, lymphoma, and other severe blood disorders. To understand how it works, let's break it down step by step. First of all, what even is bone marrow? Bone marrow is a soft, spongy tissue found inside your bones. It's responsible for producing three types of essential blood cells: red blood cells, which carry oxygen; white blood cells, which fight infections; and platelets, which help blood clot. When bone marrow is damaged, it can't produce enough of these healthy cells, leading to life-threatening complications. Thus, the damaged cells must be replaced, or rather, repopulated with healthy cells through a bone marrow transplant. The transplant begins with stem cells, the body's raw materials for creating blood cells. These can come from the patient himself in an autologous transplant, or from a donor in an allogenic transplant. The stem cells are typically collected in one of two ways: bone marrow harvest, a surgical procedure where stem cells are taken directly from the bone marrow, or peripheral blood stem cell collection. The donor takes medication that stimulates the release of stem cells into the bloodstream. These cells are then collected through a process similar to donating blood. Before the transplant, the patient undergoes conditioning therapy, which involves high-dose chemotherapy and sometimes radiation. This treatment serves two purposes: destroy the deceased bone marrow to make room for healthy cells, and suppress the immune system to reduce the risk of the body rejecting the transplanted cells. This phase can be physically demanding, as it weakens the immune system, leaving the patient more vulnerable to infections, requiring a period of quarantine for his safety. Once conditioning is complete, the new healthy stem cells are infused into the patient's bloodstream through an IV, a process that looks similar to a simple blood transfusion. The stem cells then travel to the bone marrow, where they settle and start producing new blood cells. This process, called engraftment, usually takes a few weeks. If the transplant is successful, the new bone marrow takes over and starts producing healthy blood cells. For many, this offers a long-term cure for conditions like leukemia or aplastic anemia. However, full recovery can take months or even years, and the patient will need regular follow-ups to ensure the new cells are working properly and to manage any long-term complications.
So now that you have a general idea of what a bone marrow transplant procedure looks like, now we need to take a look at it from the perspective of the patient, because you must remember that this is a very intensive procedure. There is care that needs to be applied to the patient before, during, and after the procedure, which is all going to happen in this transplant ward. And about a month, for about a month, the patient needs to stay here in a very sanitized environment to avoid harm during the procedure. And that is, of course, because as we told you in the graphics that you just watched, a bone marrow transplant procedure means that we are blocking off any kind of cell creation within the bone marrow for about 5 days during the procedure, as long as the procedure takes. And during that time, the patient is going to start to become very weak compared to what it was like before, because remember, no cells are being created. And particularly after the procedure has gone through, for about 2 weeks at least, the patient is going to be still extremely weak. So they have to stay quarantined in this room, in the transplant ward, and anything that comes in and out of the room is very much controlled, and there are no visitors that can come into the room, so they have to visit the patient outside of this glass pane. And this mirror is here because even if a doctor wants to check up on the patient, they will have to do it outside of the door, so they will have to still be able to communicate with the patient through this mirror, so that they can't really get close. The patient will stay for about a month in this room before they are ready to go back to their business as usual.
At Shariati Hospital in the Hematology, Oncology, and Hematopoietic Stem Cell Transplantation Department, as well as the Hematology, Oncology, Transplantation, and Cell Therapy Research Institute, we have over 30 years of experience since the establishment and operation of this building, transplant center, and related units. What do we do? Transplants. Transplants that include autologous and allogeneic types. What do these terms mean? Autologous refers to transplants from the patient to themselves, and allogeneic refers to transplants from another individual to the patient with specific diseases. These specific diseases include malignant blood disorders, non-malignant blood diseases, various hematological and blood-related disorders, and a significant range of other conditions like immune deficiencies, metabolic diseases, and other diseases in fields such as neurology, including MS, multiple sclerosis. In terms of the number of transplants, in over 10 indications, we began with a remarkable growth trajectory since 1989. To date, 8,300 transplants have been performed in this hospital, 5,560 of which are allogeneic transplants, transplants where a donor provides cells to the recipient. We classify this as an allogeneic transplant. The total number of transplants carried out in this center has reached 8,303, of which more than half, and perhaps over 70%, are allogeneic transplants from donors to patients. These procedures have been conducted in more than 70 indications. The statistics mentioned above exclusively pertain to bone marrow transplants. Additionally, cell therapy is part of the work performed at this center, specifically in certain indications, particularly for treating transplant complications.
So everything seems to work so far, except for one small but very major consideration, which is the issue of compatibility. The compatibility of the HLA of the donor and the receiver. The HLA is a region of the 6th chromosome in any individual, because everyone has 2 pairs of 23 chromosomes, 46 in total, and the 6th chromosome has a particular region called HLA with certain properties, certain genetic content that should match between the donor and the receiver. Now, there are different ways that we can approach this compatibility to find the proper donor, and not the most optimal donor will be always available to you. So we have the allogenic bone marrow transplant, which is a transplant between, it could be siblings, it could be a cousin, it could be someone who is completely non-related to the individual. But the siblings would be the most optimal scenario because they are most likely to share a lot of the same genetical properties. But then maybe someone doesn't have any siblings, or they're just not available, or certain properties don't match, so we would have to resort to other options, people who are non-related, maybe a cousin. And then we have another type of allogenic bone marrow transplant, which is a haplo bone marrow transplant, which is a half-matched transplant, which would involve the genetical properties of the mother and the father, because at least you're guaranteed to have at least half of your chromosomes, the properties of half of your chromosomes taken from the father and the other half from the mother. So these are all still allogenic transplants, but then we have another type, which is called autologous bone marrow transplant, which is the transplant of the bone marrow from yourself to yourself. Because in the case of, for example, chemotherapies, while it is not directly targeting the bone marrow tissue, but the procedure is so invasive and damaging to certain cells around the cancer tumor that it may very well damage the tissues of the bone marrow. And in that case, we might need to rejuvenate the bone marrow. So we have already taken a sample of the healthy bone marrow before the chemotherapy began, and after it we will repopulate the bone marrow with the previously taken sample. Now the samples are all going to be cultivated under this hood in this clean room, Class B clean room, and under that Class A hood. And for the actual cultivation, the cells need to be put into the CO2 incubators with a temperature of 37 degrees centigrade, which is the temperature of the body, a proper climate for the cells to cultivate. So with all of that out of the way, and now let's discuss another modern type of cell therapy based on genetic manipulation or engineering of cells.
There are other advanced cell therapy procedures that are based on genetic manipulation or genetic engineering. One of the more effective ones is called CAR T-cell therapy. It's a type of advanced cancer treatment procedure that involves fortifying the body's capability to fight cancer cells. To begin with, a sample of the patient's T cells are taken. T cells begin a type of immune cell, or in other words, a type of white blood cell. These cells are responsible for targeting cancer cells, but normally they are unable to target the evasive cancer cells. But once the sample has been taken in the lab, the genetic properties of these cells are modified and re-engineered so that they could recognize and attack the previously evasive cancer cells. Then, they're multiplied to a large number to be able to fight those cancer cells all throughout the body if necessary. This multiplication, of course, requires a cell culture environment, like the one you saw at the Shariati hospital, to replicate the conditions within the body, i.e. the correct temperature and CO2 level in the incubator. Before receiving the modified cells, the patient undergoes chemotherapy to reduce other immune cells and create a favorable environment for the CAR T cells to thrive. Once infused, these modified T cells begin hunting down and killing cancer cells, leading to significant results in treating blood cancers like leukemia and lymphoma. In addition to CAR T-cell therapy, there's a similar approach known as CAR NK cell therapy. While CAR T-cells come from the patient's own body, CAR NK cells, or natural killer cells, are often derived from a donor. NK cells naturally fight cancer and infections without needing prior exposure. But when enhanced with CARs, they can become even more powerful against cancer. One advantage of CAR NK cell therapy is that it may have fewer severe side effects compared to CAR T-cell therapy, such as cytokine release syndrome and neurotoxicity, though research is still ongoing. After the infusion, patients undergoing either therapy are closely monitored for several weeks to manage potential complications. Despite the risks, CAR T-cell therapy has revolutionized treatment for patients with otherwise untreatable cancers, offering new hope in cases where traditional treatments have failed.
The first bone marrow transplant procedure in the country was actually carried out right here in this facility at the Shariati Hospital in the year 1991. And right now, the requirement for the total bone marrow transplants that are required in the country is sitting at 2,500 procedures every year. But unfortunately, the capacity that we're at right now is maximum 1,300 to 1,500 a year, and 500 of those procedures are actually being carried out right here. So even though we were among the first to join the club of countries who can carry out this procedure, the capacity that we're at right now unfortunately doesn't account for the need. Strides though are being made to get us there, and here's hoping that we'll get there sooner rather than later. And with that said, we've come to the end of this episode of Iran Tech. I'll see you guys next week.